Okay, I'm going to stop this rendering for a minute. So let's do the particles now. The particles, I'm going to turn off the building here for a minute. I'm also going to go into regular plane viewport mode here. In fact, I don't even do the ground plane. So what do I need? I want to add, actually, to the mantra node, let's add our particles in now. Now particles, not just particles, let's shift-click particles, or control-click particles to add that in. So by default, I don't even really know what we're going to get for particles. It's going to look like something, but whatever it looks like, it's going to have to get changed. So let's preemptively move over here, and I'm going to turn off the auto re-render again. It actually might be hard to see our particles on this frame, so I might go back to an earlier frame. Well, we can see them. So there they are, still multicolored apparently, which is funny. Which is not wrong. And remember, that's not the visualizer, that's the color that we had created in our particle sim before here. So, first things first is we definitely needed to turn off, we definitely need to delete that color. So I'm going to say attribute delete the color. So, okay. I'll turn the re-render thing back on. So they at least are showing up gray. They're showing up the default color of our material. It's not really enough. We need to control the size too. So I'm going to say, let me put a wrangle here for a second. If I just say p scale is equal to 0.01, that'll make them probably a lot bigger. Maybe that'll make them bigger. I want to be big enough that I can really see them. So there you go. Now they're way too big. But we can see them certainly. So what are particles? I mean, they're just rendered as spheres by default. And that's fine. But what I often find when you have many particles, when you've got like thousands, millions of particles all clumped on top of each other, is that you often don't want this full spherical shading. What I think works better for these is to say, render them as circles instead. What do I mean by that? Go to the geometry node itself for particles, go to geometry, and say, render points as, right now spheres is by default. Change it to circles, it still looks the same. Probably need to stop it and do a full re-render. Some things, especially things that deal with geometry, you need to like stop and do a full redo on in order to see them change in the interactive render. But what circles will do is it won't give us this nice rounded circular shading. It'll give us like a flatter shading like this, which is interesting. What I like about this is that it feels more like it's volumetric. It feels like these themselves are little volumes. And we can literally render points as volumes, but it's much slower. This is a very, very, very fast way of rendering points. And again, that flat look, they'll still get shadows and things, but that kind of overall flat look makes it feel like it's a fog volume as opposed to a actual sphere. So coming back to our points, or our particles rather, if I went back to point 1 or whatever, as they get smaller again, you'll feel the fact that they're just circles a little bit less. And they're still very large here. But by the time they get back down to the size that they probably should be, like 0.01, they're there, but they're more felt. You know, we can see them a little bit. They're more felt than like really explicitly seen too much. So we've discovered that we want our p-scale to be somewhere around 0.01. But we also know that we would probably want to actually randomize it rather than have them all be literally the same. So I'm going to turn that off. That was helpful, but let's do it with an attribute randomize instead. So attribute randomize. Attribute randomize now instead can set the p-scale for us. And we can do it with a ramp where we can kind of say, well, I want some big ones, but mostly smaller ones. So this is not an exact thing, but just so you can follow along, I'm going to say 0.9 and 0.5 here. That way, again, most of the particles will be in this range. I mean, all of the particles are from this range to this range, but you can see only at the very end do we have more of these small ones, or more of these big ones. Now, you can see that here. You can see we have small ones, and we have big ones. And it might seem like we have a lot of big ones, except that it's really just that the big ones are easier to see because they're so big. So that's pretty good. We don't want them to be literally 0 to 1. We want to remap these values. So 0.01 is what we found before. And let's just have the bigger ones be 0.02. I'm actually going to say it might help us a little bit if I disable the building. So now we can see the points themselves easier. So there you go. Kind of looks like smoke, doesn't it? And that's what I like. That's what I like about it being those circles. If I were to take this snapshot here and go back to the particles here and say, your spheres, and remember, we have to stop and restart it. Now we'll be able to actually get a much better comparison between the two, I think. But once we're satisfied with this, we're also going to want to mess up the size a little bit more. Remember how we said we're going to have the particle size die out over time? So this is the difference. It's almost like a more reflective thing as spheres. It stands out a little too much for me. I want it to kind of just meld in with itself, and that's what I like about the circles better. So again, going back to circles, ba-bam, ba-bam. And let's finish this off by going back to the particles here and say, this is a great starting point for our points, but we want them to fade out the older they get. And we've pretty much done this a million times at this point. So I'm going to turn this off for a minute. Once again, we need to make a wrangler that uses the age to do something to the size. And this time we're going to multiply the p-scale times something, because we already have a p-scale. So I'm going to say p-scale times equals, so multiply itself by this scaling factor we're about to come up with. N age would be it. N age, remember, is the age from 0 to 1. 1 could be when it's about to die. And if we kept it as this, though, as usual, that means we'd be getting bigger over time. So let's make a ramp. We'll call it ramp age scale. Something like this instead. And now we're able to say you should probably be your full size almost the entire time. But towards the end here, you can then, so I'll say like at 0.75-ish, I'll just say 0.75, then ramp down to the end. And if you want to be fancy, you can always add in like, more points to give it like kind of a nice little S-curve. But that's the idea. The particles will be their full size almost their entire lifespan, but then will quickly die out towards the end, whether they're in the air or whatever. I mean, hopefully they're not aging when they're on the ground because of that whole thing that we did. But if I turn this on now, we should see some of them probably be smaller, and we can see that. It hasn't fundamentally changed all of this. But once we actually render this as an animated thing, we'll see them fade out over time. So the very, very last thing for these particles that we need to do is actually set their color. Currently they're gray, which is fine, but we can do a little bit more. Remember this business with the attribute noise? Where we said based on the rest, we don't even need to say multiplicative. Let's just say that is going to be your color. So we can give it a random color, like so. And as we've proved again and again, the colors will follow it. They'll follow the points. The points will always be the same color during their entire life. That's pretty rad. Whee! They'll always be the same color their whole life, but I don't want them to be rainbow colors. I want them to be whatever colors I want. They're rainbow right now because they're literally getting random numbers, or noisy numbers. But there's nothing on here that actually lets me specify what the color is. So instead, I'm going to say make an arbitrary attribute called color lookup. This will be a scalar value, which we're not saying the color directly anymore, but if I were to visualize color lookup, it's essentially still tracking that same thing. Now there's a 0 to 1 value based on the rest. Cool. Now this color lookup is what I'm going to use with a color SOP and say, use that color lookup attribute to determine the final color. So I'll say ramp from attribute, use color lookup. Where are you? There you are. And now you can see, now I can put whatever colors on here that I want. And it'll translate the color lookup essentially into that. So if I want this to be green and I want this to be whatever, it's kind of like how we set up our visualizers all the time, really. In our case, I'm going to say the brightest color should be purely white. And this color here can be like half, or that's more like there. So nothing too crazy, just kind of a medium gray to white. And you have to realize if these are the colors that we want, we need to tell the material to not interfere. So the material right now wants to multiply those colors by this. So just set this to 1. So, any color times 1 will be itself. So in conclusion, that now should look like, well, let's just keep doing this frame, I guess, for reference. Rendering this, it should look, a little bit patchy. There should be mostly light colored particles, but some will be darker than others. So let's see what that looks like. And hopefully that really should be it for these particles here. And there you go. You can see there's a slight variation here and there, but mostly they're fairly light. We could tweak them later in the context of everything else, but what we've kind of said in this lesson and with the building in general is that the insides of the building are pretty bright. So if we render the building in here too, anytime it's like cracked open, it kind of reveals a kind of light concrete color, as you can see here. So this will basically tell that story of this. Most of this crumbly bits are pouring out of the insides of that concrete, like so. And as you can see, most of them get covered up by the building anyway. Sweet. Might be cool to see an earlier part too, like right around here where the particles are kind of cascading down the side of the face here. So I'll say like frame 60. Let's see what that looks like. So snapshot that one too. Not that they're really in the same order or showing a cohesive story forward, but you can see here, there's the particles kind of coming down the side. It might be a little easier to see if we do a full res thing. I'll do let's do that real quick. These are rendering quickly anyway, so we probably could just do full-size renders for this. We're definitely going to want to do half-size renders for the smoke, but at least for this, now you can see it easier. You can see the particles kind of flowing down the side of the building here, which is really nice. These are the kinds of smaller details that are going to be really cool to see once this whole thing is in motion. But I think you can agree, we don't want them to be too distracting. We want them to be fairly small. So it's right now, it's a nice kind of background, little extra bit of texture, while still serving their main purpose, which was seeding the smoke itself. Cool. So let's go do the last thing. Let's just render the smoke, and then I think we'll be pretty much be done.